Okay, so we will continue. So we have come to a chapter of integration of metabolism. So generally in this chapter, we will look how, for example, carbohydrate metabolism, protein metabolism, lipid metabolism, how each metabolism processes interact with each other, and the involvement of hormones in regulating all those metabolic reactions. Okay, so in this chapter, we'll be generally a bit of recap of the major metabolic pathways that we have gone through in previous lectures. And we will also look into how the integration happens, specifically in this process of fat and fast cycle. Okay. So you can download the extended notes because I will show it later on this part, the major metabolic pathways, and some recap through it. Okay. Okay, so for us to fully understand or appreciate the significance of all these individual metabolic pathways, we have to look at all these pathways as a whole, which means how these pathways integrate with each other and how it can actually regulate each other. Okay. Okay, so this is some, again, recap or what we say as the key junction points of each metabolism. Okay, so if this one is for the metabolism of glucose 6-phosphate, okay, and then this is the metabolism of amino acids process. This is not new, okay, so this is just a recap of overview before this. And then metabolism of fatty acids. Okay, if you notice, some of the key intermediates are, for example, here pyruvate. So in metabolism of glucose 6-phosphate, here one of the key things that is produced is pyruvate, and eventually pyruvate is being converted into acetyl-CoA. Same goes to metabolism of amino acids. So these amino acids can form pyruvate, and then this pyruvate again can be converted into acetyl-CoA and converted into citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. So this process is what we call as gluconeogenesis. So from amino acids, non-carbohydrate sources, we can form pyruvate and also acetyl-CoA. And then we also have fatty acids metabolism, where these fatty acids undergoing processes or reactions can eventually form acetyl-CoA as well. Okay. So the key junction points for us to remember for metabolism of glucose, amino acids, and also fatty acids are pyruvate, acetyl-CoA, and also most importantly, we want to look at this glucose 6-phosphate later. All right. Okay. So this is also a summary of the cellular localization of metabolic reactions, meaning that where these metabolic reactions takes place in our body. Okay, so for glycolysis and also fatty acid synthesis, the reaction place is within the cytosol. Okay, so this is a cell. This is a mitochondria. Okay, so in the mitochondria, beta oxidation of fatty acid takes place. There's also citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle from metabolism of glucose. Okay, and also ketogenesis also takes place in the mitochondria. So interchangeably in cytosol and mitochondria, gluconeogenesis and also urea cycle, which we have go through last week, takes place. Okay, so this is the cellular localization. Okay, so that's just a brief recap on what we have looked into previous weeks. So now we would like to look into the metabolic fate, number 4, metabolic fate of glucose, fatty acids, and also amino acids. So what I mean by metabolic fate is what would be the end product or the end reaction of this metabolism of glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids. Last sekali, towards the end, what happens to these biomolecules? Okay. So for glucose, metabolic fate of glucose, the precursor is glucose 6-phosphate. Precursor means the starting point. So only liver has glucose 6-phosphatase. So this process of converting glucose into eventually pyruvate and acetyl-CoA and going into citric acid, happens in the hepatocytes or the liver cells. Okay, because only liver has this enzyme to convert glucose 6-phosphate. Okay, so from glycolysis, this is glycolysis. After being converted into pyruvate, later on this pyruvate will be converted into acetyl-CoA and enter the Krebs cycle. Okay, so glucose 6-phosphate can be oxidized for energy, okay, in the form of ATP and also NADH. And this can be converted to acetyl-CoA, and then fat eventually can produce, or we can use acetyl-CoA to build up fats, okay. And excess glucose 6-phosphate is stored in the form of glycogen, okay, or excess glucose. Okay, so now glucose in the bloodstream has been converted into glucose 6-phosphate. So excess glucose 6-phosphate will be stored in the form of glycogen. So this is the metabolic fate of glucose, starting from after glucose being converted into glucose 6-phosphate, and then we go through glycolysis and then Krebs cycle, and excess glucose 6-phosphate stored as glycogen. Okay, so that is for glucose. So now the fatty acids, what will happen? So in fatty acids, there are three steps of metabolic reactions, which are lipolysis, followed by activation of fatty acids, and finally beta oxidation. Okay, so fatty acids are also oxidized to acetyl-CoA for energy in the form of NADH. And just briefly, fatty acids are used for synthesis of bioactive molecules, for example, hormones, cholesterols, and so on, phospholipid bilayer. Okay, and excess fatty acids are stored as triglycerides in adipose tissue. So just now, excess glucose are stored as glycogen. So for fatty acids, excess fatty acids are stored as triglycerides in the adipose tissue or fat tissue. Okay. Okay, so that is for fatty acids. And next is the metabolic fate of amino acids. In which we have gone through last week, it starts with transamination, and then deamination or oxidative deamination, and finally the urea cycle to get rid of the toxic ammonium ion. Okay, so these amino acids are actually precursors for most metabolic pathway. So if you remember last week, we have looked into how certain amino acids are actually intermediates of the Krebs cycle, for example. Okay, and these amino acids can also be catabolized to acetyl-CoA, pyruvate, and intermediates of TCA cycle. So catabolized to acetyl-CoA, catabolized means these amino acids can build up and be converted into acetyl-CoA. Okay, so amino acids are used for synthesis of enzyme, transporters, and physiologically important proteins. And it's also for us to remember that the amino acid pool in our body remains constant, meaning the amount of amino acid coming in or we acquire is equals to the ones that is being secreted out. So there's no amino acid storage in our body compared to glucose and fatty acid just now. So glucose as glycogen and then fatty acid as triglycerides, but amino acid, we don't have the storage compartment or reaction that can take place in our body. Okay, so we won't be storing any amino acid. Okay, so if you look back at all these metabolic reactions that has take place, so the central themes are these. Central themes mean what are the things that we need to remember in general when it comes to those metabolic pathways. So first thing, acetyl-CoA is the common intermediates for all metabolic pathways. So this acetyl-CoA actually interconnects glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids metabolism. So understanding that acetyl-CoA is the common intermediates, now we know that these metabolic pathways can regulate each other because they have common intermediates. Okay, so the change of level in acetyl-CoA or concentration of acetyl-CoA in our body will give an effect to all these metabolic pathways. Okay, it's like an intermediate switch, if you like to understand it that way. All right. So second point is the oxidation of dietary fuels lead to the production and also utilization of energy. in the form of ATP, NADH, and also FADH2. And NADH and FADH2 transfer their electrons to oxygen via the electron transport chain. So energy is released from this electron transport chain used to synthesis ATP. Okay, so this one is not covered in this semester for biochemistry, but something for us to understand that on top of these metabolic reactions that we have gone through in class, we also have this process, important process called electron transport chain, where this is also involved in the production or synthesis of ATP. Okay. And next point would be anabolic and catabolic pathways are distinct and coordinately regulated. Okay, so anabolic and catabolic, or we can view it as the synthesis of a biomolecules or a degradation of a biomolecules are distinct, meaning they have their own respective pathways, but they are coordinately regulated. Okay, like glucose, they have their own pathway. Fatty acid are their own pathway, but each of these pathways are coordinately regulated. Okay, so they are not independent, but interrelated with each other. Okay, so that is the central theme of all the metabolic reactions of the biomolecules: carbohydrate, lipid, fat, carbohydrate, lipid, protein. Please itu. Okay. Okay. So that is just a recap of things that we have gone through this semester. Okay, so it's also important for us to note that there's endocrine regulation of metabolism. So endocrine means it's hormone related. So there's a role of hormones in regulation of metabolism. So this depends on demand of energy utilization, and some of the main hormones would be adrenaline or epinephrine. Okay, if you find in certain papers, and then hormone glucagon, insulin, and some say cortisol are also important. Okay, we will cover this more in chapter 13 later in hormone biochemistry. But just to give you an overview over here, so this is the schematic representation of how insulin regulates the blood glucose level in our body. So for example, at resting state or homeostasis state, the normal blood glucose level is about 19 milligram per 100 ml. Okay, so this is at normal level. But for example, when imbalance occur, when there's rising blood glucose, for example, so after we have eaten something, so the the blood glucose level increase. So when the blood glucose level increase, what will happen? Pancreas will be activated. We can say that, sorry, or triggered to release insulin. Okay, so blood glucose level increase. Pancreas is activated or sense the changes in blood glucose level, so it will trigger the release of insulin. Okay, so now insulin, what will insulin do? It will stimulate glucose uptake by cells. Okay, and it will also, if there's excess of glucose, for example, the tissue cells have already uptaken all the glucose in the bloodstream. So when there's excess, this will insulin will stimulate glycogen formation for the storage of excess glucose. Okay, so when there's balance in that, so the blood glucose will fall to normal range. Okay, so for example, in situation where declining blood glucose level, when you are hungry or fasting state, so again, pancreas will detect there's a reduction of blood glucose level. So pancreas will trigger the release of glucagon. So what will glucagon do? It will stimulate glycogen breakdown to increase the blood glucose level. Okay, so this is how hormone is also important in the regulation of metabolism. Okay. All right. So that's an overview for endocrine regulation in metabolism. Okay. Now we will look into metabolic profiles of vital organs. So metabolic profiles here, just to show you what are the metabolic reactions that occur in these vital organs. So vital organs mean organs that are controlling our life. For example, the main organs in our body. Okay, so here we have brain. So brain accounts for the 20% of energy requirement of the body. So whatever that we have eaten, the energy that we have required, 20% will go to brain. Okay, so why? Because the brain needs to maintain membrane potential and also for the transmission of nerve impulse that are constantly happening when we are awake, okay, even when we sleep, right? So consumption of oxygen and glucose are constant, meaning there shouldn't be any changes or alterations in terms of the supply of oxygen and glucose to our brain. But the brain cannot store glucose, so it requires constant supply through the blood, right? And because of that, because glucose, brain cannot store glucose, and it needs to outsource glucose. Okay, so these brain cells have glucose transporter, which has a high affinity for glucose. Okay, meaning they bind to glucose easily, and so that they can utilize the glucose lah. Okay, and during a disease or starvation state, when there's effect in the or changes in the glucose level in our body, our brain will adapt and utilize the ketone body, okay, which we have already covered this before. Okay, that's about brain. So what about our heart? So heart muscles can only function under aerobic condition. So aerobic condition meaning that there's need constant supply of oxygen. Okay, so in order to do so, to maintain this aerobic condition, our hearts have high amount of mitochondria to facilitate this, and our heart muscle are also unable to store glycogen, and then fatty acids are the preferred fuel, and glucose is the least favorite. Okay, when energy demand is high, so our heart muscle will also adapt and utilize ketone bodies, and also lactate as the source of energy compared to glucose. Okay. Okay, so that is for heart. And next one would be kidney. Okay, so kidney, the major task is for excretion. So if you remember urea cycle, so urea is removed from our body through urine, which is processed within the kidney, and water soluble waste products are excreted in the urine, and the osmolarity of fluid is maintained in the urine, in the kidney, and excess water is removed. So to avoid loss of useful biomolecules, several cycles of filtration and reabsorption before the final composition of urine is determined. Okay, and energy for kidney function. So the kidney utilize a lot of fatty acid and also glucose. And kidney can also, apart from excretion, it can also be the minor site for gluconeogenesis, especially during starvation. Okay. So next would be skeletal muscle. I just quickly go through this because this is actually just a summary of what we have covered in the semester. Okay. So for skeletal muscle, so the muscle field needs are dependent on activity level. So meaning that if we are doing intense activity or intense exercise, then we may need high level of glucose, for example. But in resting state, we may not require as much of glucose. Okay, so it's dependent on the activity level. And muscle can store glycogen. They can hydrolyze glycogen in the absence of glucose. And resting muscle prefer fatty acids, while active muscle prefers glucose. So if you remember, the metabolism of glucose quicker, faster compared to metabolism of fatty acids. So that's why during active state, our muscle prefers glucose compared to fatty acids. Okay, but in resting, in calm condition, so the muscle would prefer fatty acid as their fuel of energy. Okay, and during high activity, we will develop anaerobic condition in our skeletal muscle. Hence, they will produce more lactate. Okay, so instead of producing pyruvate, they will form lactate. So the formation of high alanine, because of this, they will cause an increase of of alanine. Okay, due to the transamination of pyruvate, and proceed to liver for urea cycle and disposal of urea later on. So this is amino acid or protein metabolism that we have covered last week. Okay. Okay, as for the liver, so after being absorbed, most sugars and amino acids and some triacylglycerides travel to the bloodstream into the liver. So liver will has first access to the ingested nutrients. Okay, so liver has two main cells, the Kupffer cells, which are mainly for immunity. And the next one would be hepatocytes, where most of the metabolic reactions takes place. Okay, so in liver, we can observe a certain extent of metabolic flexibility, meaning that the liver adapts to the body needs. Okay, for example, when the diet is rich in protein, so hepatocytes or liver cells will supply themselves with high levels of enzyme for amino acid catabolism and gluconeogenesis. Okay, so they will utilize what we have acquired from our diet. Okay, but within hours after a shift to a high carbohydrate diet, so the levels of this enzyme begin to drop because we no longer need these enzymes for amino acid catabolism. So the hepatocytes will increase the synthesis of enzyme that is essential for carbohydrate metabolism and fat synthesis, for example. Okay, so the our liver will produce or send signals to each of the hepatocytes to adapt accordingly. So if our diet is high in protein, then they will secrete or synthesis a lot of enzyme that will help in amino acid catabolism. If our diet is high in carbohydrate, then the hepatocyte will secrete enzyme that will facilitate carbohydrate metabolism. Okay, so there's nothing go to waste, something like that, right? Okay. So that is about until metabolic profiles of vital organs. So this is one of the important things in this chapter, the fat and fast cycle, for us to understand the tissue-specific metabolism. Okay, so in our body, there's a division of metabolic labor, meaning that we have different organs that do different things. Okay, meaning that we have we can call it like a department. Okay, so we have brain that do brain stuff. Okay, pancreas do pancreas punya stuff, liver do liver punya stuff. Okay, so the liver would be the central distributing and processing organ for nutrients. Okay, sugars and amino acids produced in digestion cross the intestinal epithelium and enter the blood, which carries them to the liver. Okay, so after acquiring all the nutrients in the small intestine, for example, it will be absorbed into our bloodstream, and first thing they will go to liver as the first checkpoint. Okay, so some triacylglycerides derived from ingested lipids also make their way to the liver. Okay, where the constituent fatty acid are used in variety of processes. Okay, so the minute by minute adjustment that keep the blood glucose level at this where we call it normal state or normal level involve the combined actions of insulin, glucagon, also and adrenaline. Okay, so we will look into in detail for this one. Okay, so we have three states actually to understand the tissue specific metabolism. Okay, so again, tissue specific metabolism is how we understand that each tissue or each organ has different roles in metabolic process. Okay, so how to understand this, we have three conditions: well fed, fasted, and also starving. So well fed meaning when we are full, kenyang, and then fasted is during when we are hungry or fasting, puasa lah kan. And then starving is prolonged fasting. Okay, kebuluran. Right? Okay, let me share you the standard notes juga. Do you need a break for a while before we go to this? This would be another part, longer part.
Yes, sir.
Let's take a 2 minutes break. Boleh? We come back at
Boleh, Doktor.
okay. You can have a break. For those who haven't signed in your attendance, you can sign in first.